progress. There we go. So we'll get started here. My name is Avalon Powell. I am the Senior Marketing Coordinator for Plateau, and I will be assisting our presenters, Carly Barton, Braun and Gresham attorney and counselor, and David Riley. He is a Senior Wildlife Biologist with Plateau Land and Wildlife Management, with moderating questions this evening. So we are going to be covering some different supplemental water and water for wildlife activities. And then we will be covering some legal considerations for who owns the water property or the water on your property, and considerations for placing a dam on your property. We will then open it up to a Q&A at the end, and you can submit your questions through the Q&A feature of Zoom. So to access that, you should simply be able to scroll over your Zoom screen and you'll see a toolbar that pops up at either the top or the bottom of the screen. And on that toolbar, you should see an option for Q&A. If you click that, it will actually open up a separate pop-up box and you can type your questions directly in. And just note, we do have a lot of you guys joining us. We're really excited for that this evening. We're going to try and get to all of your questions. We'll be sticking around for about 15 minutes after 7 o'clock. If we don't get to your question, I will provide our email addresses at the end. You're welcome to send us an email directly and we'll get back to you. And I will also be sending out a recording of this presentation tomorrow morning. So if you want to respond directly to that email and send your question that way too, that works. So without further ado, David, I will let you take it away. Let's see here. Oh, and here's just my little hello and welcome.
All right. Well, thanks, Avalon. I'm excited to be here today. I'm glad we're getting to have this conversation about wildlife and water. It's always a really timely one here in the summertime, where we start to see water actually become a living resource in some areas. This year in certain parts of the state, we've seen a lot of rain, but some parts of the state haven't. So it's wonderful to talk about water today. So just a little bit of an overview of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department standards for supplemental water. We're also going to talk about types of different sources. I have plenty of different photos. If I went through all the photos that I have in my notebook, we would be here until tomorrow going through them. So I just chose out a few of them to go through and talk about some examples as well. And then I'll hand it over to Carly and she can talk a little bit about who owns the water on your property and dams. And then we'll follow it up with questions. So the TPWD stands for supplemental water. So supplemental water is one of the 7 activity categories that you can utilize for your wildlife management tax valuation. So if there's anyone on here today that's not familiar with the wildlife management tax valuation, that's a whole nother webinar in and of itself, and actually a whole season that we're about to start dedicating to it in September for doing seminars to talk about that with landowners and give them the information that they need. So if that applies to anybody here today, please don't hesitate. Shoot me an email or ask a question towards the end of this, and we can definitely get your name. We can reach out to you about that tax valuation. But it is one of the 7 activity categories, and that's supplying supplemental water source and the multiple different ways that we're going to talk about today for wildlife on your property. Next one. There we go. So why is water important? Well, it's a pretty I would say pretty much common sense a little bit there, in that we all have to have water. Water is a resource that not only humans have to have, but wildlife as well. But one of the big things is water is a very good source for attracting wildlife on your property. So having a water resource, especially in areas where it may be limiting, could definitely bring and attract wildlife to your property and keep them there as well. So improving that water distribution throughout your property. We've been on plenty of properties throughout the years where you drive in the front gate and there's a 10, 12 acre lake there. And that's the only water for a couple of miles. So it may be necessary to install some type of water source towards the back of the property, or in areas where you may have wonderful habitat, may have food resources, you may have everything else that the wildlife needs, but there's not a whole lot of water there. And that can be of concern. So these are why those supplemental water sources are important. Water needs can vary widely just depending upon the wildlife that we're talking about. So depending upon certain species, certain species such as quail, for example, they don't need a whole lot of supplemental water because they can survive just based on surface water, water that they collect from eating insects, eating seeds. So they don't need a whole lot of supplemental water. And I say that cautiously, and then that we do have drought cycles that seem to be coming a little bit more often than not here in Texas, where they may actually need some supplemental water because we're just not seeing as much anymore. But all wildlife need just different varying needs. So supplying them with that is important as well. And then as I spoke there about recent drought cycles, well, they underscore the importance of supplemental water, and that most of the time that we start to, I get the most questions about supplemental water is whenever we start seeing drought show up. 2011 being a really good example. I wasn't with Plateau at the time, but that's whenever you start to see these questions pop up about what can I do for water for wildlife. What can I install? Is there anything that I can help out the wildlife with? Because my tanks are dry, my creek hasn't flowed in 6 months. And 2011 was a great example of that. We were even seeing some of these supplemental water sources having trouble staying full and providing water for wildlife. I'm not sure what slide that is. There it is. Oh, types of water sources. There it is. All right. So before we get into the actual types of them, I'm going to talk a little bit about things to think about whenever you're providing supplemental water. So what it is it's landowner actively providing water in addition to natural resources. So if you have a natural source of a pond or an earthen tank dam on your property that's holding water there, but that's only refilled by natural rain, that's not what we're talking about today. What we're going to talk about is similar to what's in the photo here. This is just an example of one. This is a water table. So we're going to talk about those types of sources and less about the natural sources on your property. Providing those water sources in areas where it's limiting. So making sure that these are in areas that actually need that supplemental water. And then supplying something that's reliable, functional, and accessible. Those are three things that are really important when it comes to supplemental water. Having something that's reliable, especially with a water source that you may only check a couple times a year just to make sure that it's functional and working. So you need something that you can rely on that can continue to work throughout the year. And then accessible, you got to have something that the wildlife can actually access. That can be anything from white-tailed deer all the way down to a small mouse, something that can utilize that. So this is a little bit of repetition, but I wanted to make sure I go into the things that don't qualify. So as mentioned, those earthen stock tanks that are maintained just solely by rainfall, those do not count for a supplemental water source. With that being said, if you did build a tank on your property, say that was sometime recently, or it's something that you want to do, that could actually be considered a different activity inside of the wildlife tax valuation, may fit underneath an erosion control activity. And with that also being said, if you do have an earthen tank or earthen stock tank on your property, and you are refilling it via well water or a windmill or something so that you can maintain a constant level of water out there that then can be utilized by wildlife, in those cases, that would actually be considered a wildlife supplemental water source. So that's something just to keep thoughts on. If you have a windmill that you're not really using for anything, but it's there and it's functional, it's definitely something that you could definitely utilize that to maintain a constant level inside of that tank and utilize that as a water source. Supplemental sources that are also used by livestock. This is very common as landowners transition over maybe from a cattle operation, or they're utilizing cattle or other livestock as a way to manage wildlife and manage habitat. Then you may have livestock on your property and you got to water those just as much as you got to water wildlife. So it's really important that whatever your water source is that's going to be dedicated to your wildlife program, that water source is completely and totally used just for wildlife. That can be something as simple as just putting a fence up around it to keep out the cows, or just putting that water source in an area where the cows don't have access to, or the goats, or whatever livestock we're talking about. That's a really important one when it comes to qualifying this activity, in the county appraisal districts generally pay attention to something like that. If I always hesitate to ever include a photo if there's a cow in the middle of the picture drinking out of the water trough. That doesn't qualify, so we don't include those. in reports that we send to the county. Unreliable, poorly maintained sources that are non-functional most of the year. So just like I said, those three things: reliability, functional, and accessible. Those are really important. So if you have a source of water, maybe out there, an old cattle trough that's being utilized for wildlife, that's great. But if it's got a lot of problems, it's unreliable, it's not functioning correctly, definitely get those things functioning correctly, become a more reliable source that wildlife can utilize. And that's how that activity can qualify. And then lastly, like I said, supplemental sources that are where water's not a limiting factor. So we see this often where I'll get a photo of a water table or a trough that's 15 feet from the 10-acre lake that's on the property. Not really a limiting source at that point. Doesn't mean that that property may not have an area that actually could utilize a supplemental water source, but right on top of that lake is probably not the best spot. If there's an area in the back, that's where we utilize a lot of times, utilizing aerial imagery. You can look at neighboring properties, you can look at your area around and just kind of see where you might see some water and try to find some areas away from that 1/10 of a mile, 1/2 of a mile away from some of those other sources. Those are where we need these. That's where then the wildlife can utilize that water and also utilize that habitat that's in the area and kind of make use of all of that usable space. So options for qualifying activities. So well, trough, and windmill overflow. This is probably the most common section where I see wildlife water sources used. This is anything from a modified trough to, and we'll go through some of the more creative ones. I'll show you some photos of creative water sources out there, but this is probably the most common place that I put those water sources in reports when I talk with landowners and meet with them. And one important thing to throw on there, and I'll talk about it multiple times as we go through the photos, but having wildlife-friendly ramps that offer a safe, kind of a safety net for all species of wildlife is really important, especially when we start talking about old cattle troughs or troughs that were utilized that may have high sides. Creating some type of ramping system that can be something as simple as rocks, but we'll go through some of those photos. Wildlife water guzzlers. So there's many different options here. I'm going to show you a lot about the two that Plateau offers. We call them water tables, so you'll hear me say water guzzler or water table. It's the same thing. But there's plenty of different options out there for rainwater collections. That's also what you'll hear them called as well. That collect that runoff, collect that rainwater. They're great sources, and we'll kind of walk through some of the different options there and kind of their importance, and why those may be a little bit more suited for certain properties or not. And then last but not least, spring development and or improvements. So a lot of properties, especially when we talk about in the hill country, there are a lot of properties that have natural seeps and natural springs on them that are great sources of water, but may just need a little bit of maintenance, may need a little bit of cleaning up, and may even can use some help with some different installations and some different ideas to kind of keep that water there and keep it as a usable area for wildlife to utilize as a water source. So we'll walk through some of those photos as well. There is one last activity that's not really included on here because it's really property specific, and I didn't want to go kind of delve off into the weeds on that. But it's about marshland and wetland enhancement. So it's not something that we see very often in the hill country. It does pop up, but it's really where you've got a property that's conducive to fit this, where you have areas where marshlands or wetlands that may already be present. You can enhance those and you can create those to be a little bit better and kind of create more habitat with a supplemental water source there. Generally, we see some of these kind of towards on the eastern part of the state, and you also see them along flyways of migrating ducks and everything when those marshes and wetlands become really important for that species as well. So examples and pictures. So this is a good example of something that you can modify. I'm not saying this is a wildlife water source right now. It looks like the cows have probably just been pulled off if they're not just on the outskirts of this photo. But this is a really good example of something that landowners may already have on their property. A lot of landowners that transition over into wildlife management may be coming from an older cattle operation. So these water troughs are all over the place on a property. It can be wonderful things that you can modify for wildlife. So this is a good example of a trough that has seen its better days, but with a little bit of that time and effort into it, you can clean it up, you can get it functional, you can get it to be reliable, And it can be a great water source and to meet that modified trough qualification that you need it to be. Um, so that's a good example of just kind of something that landowners already have on their property, and all it takes is just a little bit of changes and kind of cleaning it up to work. So here's an example of one of Plateau's wildlife water tables, water guzzlers. This is a 100-gallon option. So I wanted to show a photo of these. I'm going to talk a little bit more about rainwater here in a few slides. But this is a great source of water if you have a property that maybe lacks infrastructure, or you have an area of the property where you need water that lacks infrastructure. So if you have a property that is 200 acres and the back 100 acres has no water lines, no wells, nothing back there, this system's completely self-sustaining. You can put it out as long as you can get to that portion of the property. You can put this out there, and as long as you're collecting rainwater off of it, and we're getting rains, which we always hope for here in Texas. But as long as you're getting that, this water source can be continually used. It's self-sustaining, so it's a really good option for a property that may not have infrastructure. And like I said, we're going to talk a little bit more about both of these and kind of some of the intricacies of them, and what you can look for rainwater and putting a rainwater collection system on your property. So this is a fun one. This is when I talk a little bit about some creative and doing something a little bit different. This is a natural seep or a natural spring that a landowner's taken advantage of here. I'm not sure if he just had some leftover concrete or something from a different project, but this is a wonderful little project where the landowner has found this natural seep, found this natural spring, created a little area here that's got a little divot in the concrete that allows that natural spring to flow in there, catch that water, and then hold it there. And then over time, as you can see on the back side of that little installation, it'll flow off to the backside and down into the open area. So he's not really losing that benefit of the spring that would be overflowing and maybe creating a little bit of a wetland area there and maybe creating some diversity of plant species. But it's kind of just modifying it a little bit, slowing that water down, not letting it immediately flow off and get absorbed by the soil, but catching it for a short period of time so that wildlife can utilize it. This is a great one for accessibility to wildlife. Anything can walk up to this. There's no issue with small animals or anything getting caught inside of this. They can easily walk out. It's not very deep. That's a thing to keep in mind when we talk about these water sources. Water doesn't have to be 4 feet deep or 3 feet deep. It doesn't have to be a whole lot of water, just some water there. And in this case, even some water there that's also continually moving. So you're keeping some fresh water there as well. So keep that in mind as you think about water sources and what you may want to do on your property, and that it doesn't have to be just a pool out there for the wildlife to go enjoy and jump in. It can be something just as small as this, or even a small little trough. So wildlife water sources supply the basic need that wildlife need. Wildlife will thank you for sticking around. So I throw this photo in there. I should have went back and looked and see if I could have found some more of these photos from throughout the years. This is a property that I can almost guarantee I've been working for Plateau for 6 years. I think that fox has been on that water source at least 100 times in the photos that I've received from the landowner in 6 years. So that fox sticks around. Wildlife will stick around whenever you do provide this really invaluable or valuable source to them. Water is something that sometimes often gets overlooked just because a lot of landowners think that it's always there. You've got a pond, but in certain areas where foxes may not move too far, they may not go a half a mile or more and to go get some water. So if you have that source there for them, they're going to stick around. And especially this is where it kind of plays into a full habitat and a full wildlife management program, is that water is just one piece of the puzzle here. If you've got good supplemental food, providing good nesting habitat and good cover habitat for these wildlife, this is just one piece of the puzzle to keep them around. But it is one that does, because it is a necessity for survival. So here's another example of a natural spring or a natural seep done a little bit differently here. So this spring and the seep is just kind of right along this tree line. And it was cleared out by the landowner. There was a bunch of overgrown brush. The accessibility to wildlife was really small. Things like white-tailed deer and everything weren't utilizing it just because it was so hard to get to. Small mammals may have been utilizing it, but it was also overgrown. There was a lot of sediment in it. As you can tell, there's a little bit of a road right there that runs by it. So in heavy rain events, there was some sediment that would wash down into it. So these are things that you could definitely clear out these areas, monitor and maintain them throughout the year, clear out any sediment or any new grown brush that kind of grows up around it that kind of reduces that accessibility. But this is a great, easy activity if you've got a natural seep or a natural spring in your property. Talking with your biologist, talking with either a plateau biologist or another biologist about how you can utilize that as a water source and what you need to do to keep it clean, keep it maintained, so that wildlife can continue to use it. It's a really simple activity and it's really easy. Sometimes that's all that has to be. None of these activities are really meant to be something extremely difficult or extremely hard or put a great burden on the landowner. They're supposed to be something that is simple, but gets the job done and is effective. So talking about rainwater systems, before we kind of look at some photos of those, things to consider when we talk about rainwater systems. Big thing is rainwater availability. So we could talk about rainwater availability throughout the whole state, but it's going to be completely different from El Paso all the way to Orange, Texas. So I'm not going to do that. What I did was we threw in some, I threw in kind of what my rainwater availability looks like. So I'm on the kind of the western edge of the Post Oak Savanna, and we see about 35 to 45 inches of rain a year. If you asked me this last week, I would say we got 35 inches last week because it rained all week long. So it just depends. It also depends upon the year. You may not get as much. So that's a good average to kind of base things on. So that's always something to keep in mind when we talk about rainwater collection is how much rain are we going to see? And that kind of really plays into these next two of these other things, talking about storage capacity and then the size that you may need to collect rainwater. So size of the area that catches that rainwater. Well, we can talk about how big is the roof or how big is the area and the surface area that you're collecting on. By no means am I a math major, so I'm not going to go into the math of it here, but essentially about a half a gallon per inch of rain per square foot of area that you're capturing on. So that's a good way to kind of utilize that to think about how big of a surface area do you need. I'll come back to accessibility, but then storage capacity. Larger storage is going to require a larger roof to fill it up faster. So all of those three things there are things to really keep in mind whenever you're deciding on what kind of source, rainwater collection source you want to either buy and install, build yourself. My biggest thing with storage capacity, we have a little bit of rainwater collection here. And I've got a barn that's probably 500-600 square feet. And I have just a 55-gallon drum and I see it flow over all the time. And that's the biggest pet peeve of mine. So I'm buying more and more tanks because I want to catch that water. I'm not going to just let it go to waste. So keeping those things in mind and kind of what you need, how much rainwater you're going to get, as well as just how you're going to catch it and store that. So accessibility is really important on this one as well. Accessibility for wildlife is always important, but accessibility for yourself when we talk about rainwater systems. So as mentioned, these systems are self-sustaining, so they can go in areas that are completely self-sustaining. So they're out in the middle of nowhere, could be buried off into the back portions of your property that you don't go to very often. And in those cases, especially when we talk about the plateau water tables, you can break these things apart into small pieces and put them in the back of a mule or put it in the back of a truck. So it's pretty easy to get them there. But keep in mind that with some of these recent droughts that we've had, or if you have any issues, maybe with some predators, feral hogs being the most common, maybe causing some damage, flipping over a water trough, draining that water trough out by doing that. If you, in those cases, you may have to help these rainwater sources a little bit, give them a little bit of water. I have some landowners that every time they go check it, they check it about once a month. They just take a 5-gallon bucket with them and pour it down the gutter. And so they just add a little bit of 5 gallons every now and then. Never hurts to do that. So making sure it's accessible for you as well is definitely going to be important whenever we talk about these sources. So these are the two options that Plateau offers. The one on the left is a 305-gallon table. I believe it's about 6 foot by 5 foot roof. And then the one on the right is a water table 100 or 100 gallon. It's about a 5 by 5 roof. They these are the two options that Plateau offers. Again, these aren't the only things out there on the market. There's definitely larger guzzlers. There's guzzlers that kind of fit a little bit more into the ground, that are more ground level, that collect. So there's a bunch of different options out there, but I wanted to show you these. The great thing about these horses as well is, as you can see, there's that small little trough there, and that kind of goes back to that statement I made about you don't have to give them a pool or a hot tub or anything like that. All you need is just a little bit of water for wildlife to utilize. So that right there holds about 12 to 15 ounces of water. There's a little float valve on it, so you can definitely add a little bit more or a little bit less. But that's an easy, accessible water source for all wildlife. Deer will utilize that, but you can even have insects and small mammals. They'll come up there and they can climb on those rocks, utilize that water source. It's never a danger to them to drown or anything because it's not that deep. They can easily get out and escape from that. I always put rocks inside of there as well. That sometimes prevents the feral hogs if they want to try to flip that thing over. Maybe that'll entice them not to. But these are just great sustaining, self-sustaining water sources that you can put out on your property, out in the middle of nowhere, and kind of let them take care of themselves, and you just kind of monitor and maintain them. Big thing to also remember on rainwater tables or anything that's a guzzler is location of where you place these. Never want to place one of these right underneath an oak tree because you will be cleaning out the gutters every single day. So kind of taking them off. And that also, on the flip side of that, you also don't want to place this out in the middle of an open field with nothing else around it, because wildlife aren't going to utilize that. Wildlife are, as we all know, when you walk past a white-tailed deer, usually you get about 5 seconds of seeing it and then it takes off into the brush. So they're not going to walk out generally out into the big open field to get a drink of water. They'll go find water somewhere else. So putting these right there at the edge of that habitat, where you've got a tree line, somewhere they can come out, get a little drink of water, and then go back into that escape cover, that safety that they're used to. So when we talk about those sources, I also wanted to throw this one in there as well, because we talk about water just being a piece of the puzzle when we talk about wildlife management and habitat management and providing sources for wildlife. This is another option that kind of fits two activities in one here. So this is what we call our Quail Station or small wildlife station, kind of dependent upon your target species and what you're looking at serving here. But this is a water table 100 that is completely wrapped in some cattle panel. I believe it's 4x4 panel that doesn't allow larger animals and everything to get in there. And then that little green barrel in there is a small wildlife feeder, songbird feeder, quail feeder, that they can utilize that to get some seeds as well, while also getting their water, and all encompassing in that they're in an area that's safe for them. They can get away from predators. This photo here is before we did. Generally, once we before we wrap this thing in brush, generally after we install it and we have it all ready, we take some brush clippings and some things around it and kind of cover it up a little bit. So it's a perfect little habitat, little escape cover for wildlife. Small mammals, songbirds will utilize this, but it keeps out that bigger wildlife from utilizing all of the water and all of the feed, as well as it keeps predators away as well. They can utilize this as a safe place for them. So this is another option just to kind of kill two birds with one stone, so to speak there. But it's another option for a water source as well. So I've kind of walked through a lot of the stuff about the water tables. I'm not going to go through each one of these. Some of these did catch my eye earlier today when I was looking through this presentation. And the one in there, it says freeze resistant. If we have another freeze like February, I'm not sure, because I think that's a little bit of an outlier. But what we mean by that freeze resistant there is that there's no pressurized system. This isn't something where you have to worry about a pipe bursting and flooding anything. Freeze resistant, we get our normal freezes, our light 32 degrees, 31 degree winters that we're used to here in Texas. It may freeze that line up, but once it starts to thaw out, it'll definitely continue to start flowing. So these are useful for all wildlife species, as I mentioned, with that small little trough there. Anything can utilize it, and then they're highly portable. So if you ever want to move it, it's not too hard to move, other than dumping out whatever rainwater collection that you've already collected, unless you have a tractor or something to pick it up. That would be your only loss there, but they're highly portable. So they're great water sources. And so we wanted to mention this before I forgot. Right now, we are having a sale on those sources. So if it's anything that's interested you, if you have any questions about those sources, I know I talked a while about them. Feel free, reach out to myself or reach out to in the questions and question and answer period. We can ask some questions about those or answer some questions about those. Or I can definitely get you in touch with an account manager if it's something that you're looking at. I know right now we're kind of limited on quantities. We've just started this sale and then it started to really take off really fast. So if it's something you're interested in, please let us know as soon as possible. So we're going to go back through a few more examples here, and then I'm going to let Carly take over. But this is a really interesting, and this is where I talk about creativity in your water sources. Think outside the box a little bit. I'm not 100% sure on this one as well, but I think the landowner did actually have some leftover concrete on this project that he was working on somewhere else. So he decided, hey, I'm going to build a little water source, a little shallow area for him. So he just took some concrete, created a little divot in it there where it collects water, and it's all running off of a hose. This isn't a float valve system or anything. He had to go out there, or the landowner had to go out there and turn on this water every few days or so, flush out some of the old stuff. Really neat that he created that little channel there. I believe it runs down into a pond below. So he's not, again, not losing any water. He's just kind of managing it a little bit differently, where he's stopping it up here where he can then utilize it for wildlife and then move it on from there and clear out that area. It's a really creative idea. Again, accessibility here is top notch. Anything can get to this and utilize it. Another creative idea, took an 8-foot wide normal cattle trough you can pick up at Tractor Supply, any feed store, and sunk it into the ground. So kind of took the opposite idea that I would usually think on accessibility, building something to climb in. He just sunk it into the ground so that wildlife could walk right up to it. So this is a great water source, completely different than what I generally see, but it's great with that rock in the middle. That's a great way for wildlife to be able to escape. You can even see some rocks on the edge over there. So squirrel or something falls in, they can swim around to the other side. So these are all these options when we talk about trough modification. I can say I've seen it all, but I know I'll see a new trough modification this year when I talk to a landowner. So these are different options. So think outside the box, think creatively. These are definitely great water sources that can be utilized by wildlife. And it doesn't have to be something as complicated, but it definitely can work. So I always like to throw in a little bit of discussion about documenting your activities. That's what I do on a daily basis with Plateau, is work with thousands of landowners and talk about how we're going to document their activities so that we can show the Central Appraisal District this is what they did. So I always like to throw this in there. Supplemental water can be one of those harder ones because kind of once you get it established and you get it started, every picture looks the same and everything looks pretty much the same. If it doesn't change from year to year, it doesn't change from even month to month or anything like that. Documenting is important. So one thing I usually recommend is once you get it all set up, keep a running log of just the days you go out there and check it. You may even want to keep a running log of how much water was in it, how much water you added, and then just snap a photo of it. I generally recommend landowners choose different angles every time. Just kind of walk around it, choose a new spot. You can even just maybe take a photo of the water table itself and not the trough, or vice versa there. So just keep some documentation showing that you're monitoring and maintaining it on a yearly basis. Supplemental water or activities that are technically underneath the text parks and wildlife guidelines considered 10-year activities. But I like to call them forever activities. As long as you monitor and maintain them forever, and it's continued to be a reliable functional source, it can continue to count. You don't have to create a new source every 10 years. You don't have to replace this source or anything. It can continue to count from year to year. So documenting your activities, I could go on about that forever, but about water, just snap some photos of it and keep a running log just to let you know, let the county appraisal district know that you're watching it and you're monitoring it. All right, last few photos here. This is going to be my only story, I think, throughout the day. So this is a really interesting and very creative source of water. We have this landowner in Hayes County that this is the way she wanted to do her supplemental water, and I think it's great and it's a creative way to do it. Essentially, these water pans, cookie sheets is what I was calling them. She had about 5 to 10 of them throughout her property, and she lived on property. Every morning she'd get up with her dogs, grab 2 gallons of water and start walking, and she would go dump out these pans, clean them out, rinse them out, and put fresh water in them every single day for as long as we had that property that we were working with. and I remember when it got brought to me the first time, and I was like, it counts, like it's qualifying. It's a little different. It's a little bit more labor intensive than I would want to do, but it works. So that's not to say you need to go buy some cookie sheets tonight and start filling them up with water or anything. But it's a creative way, and it kind of proves that point of that you can be creative with this. You can build some really unique water sources that can be utilized by songbirds, that can be utilized by certain wildlife. So think outside the box. Don't ever hesitate to reach out to us here at Plateau. If you've got an idea and you're like, I don't know if this is going to count or not, reach out to us. We'll be more than happy to talk to you about it. Kind of run through the ideas, flesh out the ideas, and if it works, hey, we can help you out and getting some ideas built up and to put that in your wildlife management plan. Here's another interesting one. This photo I found in an old water presentation that we gave, but it's another unique one. It's something that's a little bit different. You can fill this, I think it's about a 2.5-inch pipe, PVC pipe. That water will hold in there at the bottom of that, and it's just sitting up, propped up against that tree. It's a small little area for wildlife to utilize. So the benefit there, just like those other small troughs that come with our rainwater systems, there's not a whole lot of evaporation loss here. So it's a great amount of water that's perfect for wildlife to utilize. And it's interesting and it works. So whatever works for you, go for it. It's definitely something that you can utilize on your property. And then back to trough modification. This is just as simple as some of the other photos that I've showed, but I do want to talk about a little bit about those ramping systems that I've discussed. It doesn't have to be anything of great detail. It doesn't have to be something that is very crazily built. It can be something really simple that is just some rocks or some pipes, something there that can allow wildlife to get in and out. You can even use hardware cloth or cattle panel, something like that would work. So these are just some examples of that. One more, I think.
Oops, can you see the one on?
There it is. There it is.
Yeah, sorry, it takes a little bit sometimes.
That's fine. So Windmill Overflow, this is going to be my last slide. So Windmill Overflow is great. It's a horrible photo because you can't see the windmill that I'm talking about, but that windmill is feeding that cistern. And the landowners just allowed that cistern to overflow a little bit and create some puddles of water on the ground here. Very simple, very easy activity, especially if you already have all the infrastructure. It's just changing some valves so that you can allow it to overflow. The other benefit of this is that you've got that water flowing onto the ground there, and it's creating what I like to call a wildlife oasis. So it's not just so great or it's not just good because it's got water there that wildlife can utilize, but that water on the ground is also going to produce diversity of plant life, diversity of insect life that all of our songbirds and quail and everything need. So this is a wonderful, easy activity for a landowner that might have the infrastructure, just letting that windmill overflow a little bit. So when we talk about water on properties with landowners, generally the first things we talk about is we talk about what water they already have on the property. We talk about the rivers, we talk about the streams, we talk about the lakes that may be on the backside of their property. And generally the questions that pop up is, what can I do with that? What am I allowed to do with that water that is flowing through my property? So Carly's going to talk a little bit about that and how you can do something with that water on your property.
Well, thanks, David. I appreciate it. Again, I'm Carly Barton. I work at Braun and Gresham. We are the sister company to Plateau Land and Wildlife, and we love partnering with them because you send us fun pictures of wildlife and things like that instead of boring laws. But I'm here to talk to you a little bit about who owns the water on your property, and then which is not a simple question as you think. And then a little bit about what can you do with that water, specifically if you'd like to build a dam. So who owns the water on my property? The answer to that question is the old, what the good lawyer answer to that is, it depends. If you just click one more time, Avalon, there it goes. It depends. So there are different types of water, main types of water. You can go back out, Avalon. I'm gonna just sit and talk for a little bit. There are two types of water on your property. There is groundwater and surface water. When it comes to groundwater, that's a pretty that it kind of explains it. It's water from the ground. So it's what's below the surface. You own that water that where your land is. There's a concept in property law that if you own a piece of land, you own what is below it and all the way up to the sky. So there are some limitations with that, but that is generally the concept of property ownership. So you own the water below, and when you see those windmills, when you see your wells, you're getting that groundwater out of those aquifers. Now, generally we follow the rule of capture, which means once you grab that groundwater once you get it out of the ground and it's yours, and you've captured it. Now, that can lead to some pretty interesting situations with your neighbors. If your neighbor has a well and you have a well and you're pumping out too much, and it can dry out your neighbor's well and vice versa. So those things can get a little dicey. That's why we have the legislature has created things like groundwater conservation districts and things like that, where you do have to have certain permits and limitations on pumping out of certain aquifers, because we want to preserve that. So generally you get the water underneath your land, but there's probably going to be some permitting and issues like that before you can do whatever you want with it. So the second type of water is called surface water. And so that, again, is pretty explainable. It's the water that's on the surface, right? That's your lakes, your streams, your rivers, your, things of that nature. And in general, there's a statutory definition of it in the state of Texas. It's the ordinary flow of rivers, streams, lakes, bays, or arms of the Gulf of Mexico, or water courses. It covers a bunch of things. And actually, I'm here to tell you that that surface water doesn't belong to you. That actually belongs to the state of Texas. And so that's where we run into issues about what can you do with that water, because technically it is owned by the state. And so when we talk about who owns your water, it depends. It could be you, it could be the state of Texas. If you live near a really big river, or like the Sabine or the Mississippi, the federal government of the United States owns that river. So you'd have to determine who owns the water, and then what can you do with it to figure out the rights you have as landowners. And now I'm ready for the next slide, Avalon. So in terms of, if we're talking about like a river, a stream, or a creek, and what you can do with those types of bodies of water, you really have to determine whether they are navigable. So, and you'd think that would be pretty easy. Can I put a boat down it? Can I row my kayak? Surely that means navigability, Carly. And I'm here to tell you, I'm sorry, it doesn't, and it gets really weird and dicey. And it's a definition that changes every single year. There is tons of litigation about this in front of the United States Supreme Court. They're always fighting about water rights. And so it's definitely an interesting area of the law, but under federal law, to determine navigability, it's what falls under the Clean Water Act. And so we have these kinds of definitions of navigability, that it's to traditional navigable water, or it's an interstate water. So, we're talking about, like the Mississippi, rivers that go right in between states, or the Red River. Then we have territorial seas. Those are kind of our oceans before they get into international waters, impoundments of jurisdictional waters, and then tributaries or adjacent waters. So those are waters that are close to a traditional navigable water, or maybe like a offshoot or creek of the Mississippi or something like that, where you have to have a nexus to that traditional navigable water or interstate water. So it might not be that you have the actual river on your property, but you have an offshoot or a creek or something like that. So that is for the federal government. But we also have Texas. So that is Texas's definition of navigability, or that's the federal definition, but we also have Texas. And so there's two ways to determine navigability in the state of Texas. There's navigable in fact. So that means that the creek or the river is being used, it has a commercial use. It is a common highway of trade and travel. So those are going to be some bigger rivers and creeks where there's actually activity on it. And then you have navigable by statute. And this is just a stream which retains an average of 30 feet from the mouth up. This is where things get really interesting about how that 30 feet is measured. The General Land Office of Texas has some great resources that can help you with determining whether the body of water is navigable by statute. They have a Texas surveyor who can help out, but that's usually where we get into some arguments and discussions about whether that is navigable. And so I'm sure you're asking me, Carly, why does it matter if it's navigable or not? And so what matters is because depending on its navigability, it means what can you do with it. So if you're trying to dam something on your property, you have to figure out if it's navigable or not, because there's going to be a ton of permits that you have to go through to figure out to build that dam. And next slide, Adeline. So what are these kinds of permits and regulations you've got to look out for? We've got, in the federal government, it's the Army Corps of Engineers. So if you were going to build a dam on your stream or river or creek, we have to make sure that it's not navigable under the federal definition. If it is, there's a nationwide permitting system. We go through the Army Corps of Engineers office in Fort Worth, and we go through their permitting process and information through there. There are exceptions to permitting. There are agricultural exceptions, but you have to fall under an exception if the body of water on your land is navigable under the federal government. So let's say we fall under an exception. We don't have to deal with the federal government, but we still got the state of Texas. So the state of Texas, because for surface water rights and for damming of surface water, which are your streams and rivers, you really have to go through the TCEQ. They are the ones who are going to give you your permits for your dams and things like that. So TCEQ is someone you'd have to get your permit through. And then also one that kind of really trips people up is you do need to go through the Texas Parks and Wildlife for a sand and gravel permit. If you are digging into the beds and into the mud of the banks of these rivers or streams or creeks, you've got to get this kind of permit from Texas Parks and Wildlife. So that can be another thing that kind of trips you up when you're trying to build a dam. And lastly, you have your local authorities as well. So you'll have to go most time through your county. You'll have to probably get a county development permit just because you're going to be building something. And your counties are also your FEMA floodplain administrators. So if your dam goes and alters the floodplain and alters it for, your neighbors downstream, anything like that, you've got to get permission through the floodplain administrator. So, but luckily there are some, like I talked about, there are some exceptions to this. So if you're doing something smaller, if you're doing something for a domestic or livestock or agricultural and including wildlife falls under that. If you are damming up a creek or stream for less than 200 acre feet, you will likely get around a lot of these permitting steps. But the problem is you got to make sure that you're not missing one of those steps. I can't tell you how many times I have landowners who get through and they say, oh, I followed the exception. The guy I hired to construct my dam said, I don't need to get a permit. They build it, and then TCQ, Texas Parks and Wildlife, someone gets tipped off about this dam that they built, and then they're trying to fix a lot of problems. So, but these are kind of the big regulatory hoops that you would potentially have to go through in order to build a dam on your property. So what do you do if you do want to build a dam on your property? So my biggest number one advice is to talk to your neighbor, because if you're damming up a stream or a creek or a river, you will likely be affecting your neighbor's property. And so, like I said, a lot of times I get clients, it's their neighbor got upset because they built a dam, they fixed a dam, there's construction going on, they didn't know what the construction was, and then they freak out because they're worried that they're not going to get any more water, it's going to hurt the flow of the water and things like that. So please talk to your neighbor. That's always just a good advice for any kind of dispute like that. Next thing, hire knowledgeable engineers or construction professionals who have built multiple dams, who know that you need to go through permitting, engineers who can show you that it's going to be less than 200 acre feet, things like that. If you really find someone who's knowledgeable on the front end, makes things go smoother on the back end. And then of course, consult with an attorney. There are tons and tons of permits and regulatory hoops that you have to jump through. And it could be that you're going to do something small enough and your project's not going to require a bunch of permits, but it certainly helps when you have someone who's there to help guide you through that and can help you sidestep all of those hurdles. So, and luckily we do have, relationships with, if you get a good attorney who knows what they're doing, they have relationships with those agencies, they've been in front of them before, and they can help you navigate that process. So that is, that's kind of, what you need to know to build a dam on your property. And if you'd like to kind of turn that surface water into something that is more beneficial to your land and increase your water resources. So, and I think this is the family of companies. Like I mentioned, we have Plateau Land and Wildlife. I'm an attorney at Braun and Gresham, but we also have Plateau Land Group. They are an offshoot that works with rural landowners who are buying or selling their land, who can give you advice about the intricacies and the uniqueness of buying and selling rural land and what you need to do. We also have Plateau Exchange. That is for a 1031 exchange. If you were to purchase, there's a very fun tax code provision about 1031 exchanges, so that you can defer capital gains taxes when you sell a property and reinvest it in another. So that is the family of companies, and we like to partner on webinars like this. So we're very happy that you came. I think we definitely have time for questions, and so please put them in the chat. We're happy to answer any of them. I'll try to answer all your water questions. You might get a few "it depends" from me, but we're so happy to have you join us. And so I'll let, if y'all have any questions, just let us know.
Awesome. Thanks, Carly. And thanks, David. I'm going to leave up our contact information here as we go through questions, just in case you want to jot it down. If you have something that you want to speak to specifically to one of the presenters about, you've got it there. And otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and hop into some questions here. So I had a couple of pre-submitted ones that came in by email. First one here, I am interested in the use or success of liners and pond construction. What are your thoughts?
Oh yeah, so that's definitely a good question. So if I can kind of talk a little bit more, I'll kind of go a little bit more in depth on that. So when building a pond or building anything like that, typically you have to do some type of lining of that pond, with something being, there's even plastic liners. A lot of times bentonite clay and other things are used to keep that water from flowing through a dam and completely leaking out. There's plenty of ponds built all over the hill country where it's beautiful, looks great, and you come back 2 months later and there's not a drop of water in it. And it's because it wasn't lined right. So I specifically, I haven't had any experience with the plastic pond line or anything. I know there's plenty of engineers out there. There's plenty of pond construction companies that really utilize that bentonite clay, and they've used some of those pond liners. So I think they would have a little bit better of better of an idea of which ones work best, which ones survive best over that harsh environment. So I'd definitely say if that's something that you're interested in, we do have a couple companies that we work with that we can make some recommendations for, that we could definitely reach out to you and see if we can provide you with some names that could maybe answer that question a little bit better than I could, because I'm by no means an engineer.
Awesome. Thanks, David. What are what restrictions are there for the relocation of water sources? So like a water structure or a water well?
Okay. I may be able to, so I'll answer what I thought the question was, and then maybe Carly can answer the other side of that. So what I was thinking on I was immediately went to the text parks and wildlife guidelines. So the water structures, if you have a water source on your property, you're utilizing it for your tax valuation, moving that in different areas of your property. There's no concern or anything there. The only concern would be just making sure that it's still in an area where it's necessary and that you're kind of meeting those things that make it qualify. So that's what I was going to answer it as. It may be a question more to the fact of like moving wells on a property, and I think that might have to deal with kind of like the groundwater conservation district or somebody. So
yeah, if you're talking about relocating a well, it would depend on what groundwater conservation district you're in. There's certainly amounts and levels of permits that you have to apply for. Some wells are grandfathered in, some are not. And you just have to go through those restrictions to see what they allow on your land in particular.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. We have no live water on our property. Do you recommend water catchment for our wildlife, and which system is best for 5 acres?
Yeah, so that would probably be the best option. That'll be probably the cheapest option. And not knowing where your property's at, if it's in the middle of the hill country and you got to drill a well through 15 feet of limestone, I can guarantee you that a water catchment system is going to be the cheapest option there. So yeah, that works great. You can put it anywhere on the property. So where it would be collecting water for 5 acres, not really seeing the property or anything about it. You could really go with either one of those sources, a 100-gallon or 305. And then, like I said, there's other different options out there in the market. The size is kind of more dependent upon your worry of how much rainfall and everything that you may get, and how much storage capacity that you would like to fill a trough or to fill a small little pan. So that's where really the size plays into role. But you could put a 305-gallon water table in, on a couple 1,000-acre property or on a 5-acre property, and it would still kind of provide that source.
How large is the roof on the 305 water table?
I believe it's 6 foot by 5 foot. I probably have someone that's listening to this right now telling me no, that's not it. So if anything pops up in my teams here that tells me that I'm wrong, then I'll let somebody know. But I believe that's what the size of it is.
Awesome. How do we keep feral hogs away from the water table troughs?
Oh, how do we keep feral hogs away from anything? I mean, feral hogs are probably the hardest things to deal with. So short answer is there's not a way to keep them away. But with that, you can definitely come up with some creative ideas to keep them away. So one thing we do whenever we install any sort of like small pan that comes with our water tables, we have stakes that we stake that down with. We try to keep them from flipping it over as much as possible. If you go with a larger style water trough, like one of those modified trough options, they really can't utilize it as much, especially if you have one with really high sides, depending on how big the pigs are that are coming around it, but they can't utilize it as much. They'll tear everything up around it. Best option there is if you have a feral hog problem, they're messing with your water sources, we can add a new activity to your wildlife management plan, and we'll start working on a predator control option too. Because that's about the only option really, is to start controlling them. And then slowly over time, you may be able to get some relief on your water source.
So there was that photo of I think it was like a water tank, David, where it was like sunk into the ground, and then there was a rock in the very middle of it. The landowner was asking if there was goldfish in the water.
Yeah, I saw that question pop up. So yeah, I would assume that the landowner put some goldfish in there. I'd be curious to see how long they lasted and how many birds of prey were flying down and picking out goldfish for the next week. after that. But yeah, I know some landowners utilize goldfish or use koi or something like that, just to kind of keep the algae levels down. That actually brings up a really good point about these water troughs. So those bigger troughs, being out there in the middle of nowhere, being in that sun, algae growth is going to happen. So I tell a lot of landowners too, just throughout the year, you may want to drain it once or twice, especially if you got a big trough like that, and you have the ability with a float valve, and you've got the water that's there, and you're not solely worrying about rainwater collection. Go out there and clean it out. Get a good scrub brush, clean it off a little bit, keep some of that algae down. It's water. These are wildlife. They drink out of a hole in the ground that's got dirt in it. It doesn't have to be perfectly clear, crystal clear water, but over time, it doesn't hurt to kind of clean it up a little bit. And I got corrected on the size of it, and it is a 5 by 8, 5 foot by 8 foot. Collects about 20 gallons per inch.
So glad we've got some team members listening on.
Yeah.
Carly, I think this one's a question for you. So you were talking about those permits. The permits do not apply to small bridges that don't affect water flow, correct?
It depends. No, I think so. There is not, if it is a navigable stream, and you're building a bridge over it, then it is, there is some permitting you have to do. That would be specifically through the GLO. And it might be a pretty simple, it makes it a little simpler that you're not affecting the water flow. But because if it hits that threshold of navigability, because it belongs to the state and you're doing something across a state body of water, there's likely going to be a permit that you have to fill out. I see the next one is, it asks, is the North San Gabriel considered navigable? So I don't know off the top of my head, but I would look at the GLO, Texas Parks and Wildlife. They have a few, I think, the North San Gabriel is probably big enough that it is navigable. That would be my hunch. But there's definitely some resources that can see if it's already been designated that, or someone's already looked into that, and then you can go from there.
Awesome. I've heard that building a pond and supporting it with a well is illegal. Is that correct?
I haven't heard that. I could imagine that there could be some groundwater conservation districts that's become a concern and a question. But I haven't heard anything specifically, or I haven't heard it brought up anywhere. Carly, is there anything you've heard?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd say it's illegal, but you do have to follow the restrictions of the groundwater conservation district that you're in with that well. I would be interested. I think a question that would need to be answered is it a grandfathered well? Where is it? What are the other restrictions put on it? Because yeah, I'd say that probably is not a good thing.
Yeah.
How long does it take to get a tax benefit via a wildlife water program on my property, and how does this affect property valuation?
I'm assuming this question is kind of playing into the tax valuation itself there. So if you installed a wildlife water source today, you'd start receiving credit. So if you already had wildlife tax valuation on your property, I'll start there and then I'll maybe work my way back. If you already have that on your property and you install a water source today, it starts counting immediately as a qualified activity to meet the minimum requirements to maintain that valuation. How would it affect that property valuation? So it really wouldn't change anything that you already have. So kind of working my way back is, if this question is kind of talking more about how to get into the wildlife program, how to get into the wildlife tax valuation, this is just one activity inside of that. So if your property did meet minimum requirements and there's no issues with it getting into wildlife management, and like I said, that's a whole other webinar and a whole other series that we could talk about. But as long as you could get into that wildlife tax valuation, your taxes would be neutral across that 1D1 open space. And then your water program and having supplemental water on it would just be one of those activities of many different options that you could do to maintain that valuation. So if you have more questions on that, my email's up, I think, right now. Feel free to shoot me an email. we can kind of talk about it. I can give you a call. We can kind of talk about your valuation, or I could have one of our team members give you a call that can kind of walk you through the beginning sides of it.
That's awesome, David. And I also, since you mentioned a whole other webinar, we actually do have our fall webinar series kicking off in September. I believe the first one is September 21st. I need to look at my calendar and confirm that, but I will have those published on our website webinar page coming up later this week. So if you wanted to check back, look at our website and see those upcoming webinars, they're free to attend. You could sign up and learn a little bit more about wildlife management. Does surface water restrictions apply to intermittent wet weather creeks?
Yeah, this is a really good question because I kind of glossed a little bit over it. But the difference between, there's groundwater and there's surface water, but what happens when you have like rainwater and it drains? So that's called diffused surface water. While it's kind of trickling down and through the land, it is yours. It's the landowner's until it gets to a water course. So until it gets to like a stream or a more consistent creek, it is yours. So as long as it's not to the water course yet, that is yours, and you can, I'll say, pretty much do whatever you want with it. I won't give you free rein, but yes.
All right, so this landowner just bought a plot of land. There is no standing or running water, but there appears to be a natural path for heavy rainwater to flow. Are they allowed to build a small tank or pond in this area to capture natural rain runoff?
Yes, you'd be able to do that. It's really when you get into damming up creeks and affecting streams and your neighbors' resources, downstream. But you really you can capture your rainwater and you can build those small tanks and ponds. You just don't want to divert water onto your neighbor or do something that's really going to change too much of what's already naturally occurring.
Got it.
And I'll back that up with Carly there too, where if you get a good engineer, you get someone that knows what they're doing when they build those ponds, that's the first thing they're going to look at. Is they're going to pull up an aerial map, they're going to pull up topo maps, and they're going to make sure that whatever they do and whatever they build is not going to have huge effects on anybody. There may be slight changes where some runoff runs, but they're not going to let your neighbor's house flood or anything like that. That's their job. That's why they're engineers.
Absolutely.
If I have horses on my 15 acres, I can't still set up a supplemental in one of the pastured areas.
So with having horses on the property, this is kind of where that qualification comes into play. So generally, the way the TPWD guidelines recommend is that it has to be a dedicated wildlife water source. So if livestock are utilizing it, by the book, it doesn't meet qualifications. With that being said, what I would recommend is that if you have multiple pastures, or if you have different pastures with different water sources in them, the pastures that the horses aren't in that often or may not be in, maybe developing maybe a movable ramp or something that they can utilize that water source when the horses aren't there. But from technically by the book, if it's just one water source in there with the horses, it doesn't meet qualifications. By no means does that mean that like you have to, wildlife are still going to utilize it. They're still going to go for it. They're not going to just know that they can't have that water source. But from a qualification standpoint, that would be a little bit concerning, especially if it was one of the last activities you needed to meet those minimum requirements. So a couple different options there. You could even come up with a smaller water source somewhere else that may not be inside of a horse pasture, could be somewhere else, or maybe some type of way of keeping the horses outside of a different water source, maybe somewhere else on the property. So that would be my recommendation in that case.
When buying or selling a property, what is typically seen with negotiating water rights as you would minerals?
That is really water rights and negotiating those kinds of things in terms of being separate from your property. If you're that's complicated and probably out of my sphere of expertise. You can sell your water rights. You can lease the rights to your groundwater and your wells, particularly if they're grandfathered, they're old, they don't have the restrictions that the groundwater conservation districts have imposed on them. You can sell them to commercials. I mean, you've got water supply companies all up and down near San Antonio and Comal buying up these old wells and selling them selling the rights to them to, supply these big developments with water. So yes, you can do that. I don't know what's typically seen in negotiating them, but if you'd like to talk to someone who does know, we can find you someone who does.
Well, it's funny that we're on a webinar together and having this conversation. That question pops up. We actually worked with one of Braun and Gresham's whenever we purchased our property out here for water right issues because it was sold before we bought the property. So yeah, there's definitely someone there. I can vouch for that because someone talked to me about it.
We have a pond or tank that is supplied by runoff or drainage from a neighbor's land uphill. A single family development has started construction on the neighbor's land. They'd offered to give us the same amount of runoff before development. However, we're concerned about the quality of water from the homes. Would you prefer to keep runoff or install a well to keep the pond full?
It's a good question. I would be curious if there's anything more inside of any contract or anything that whatever the construction company or developmental company, if there's something there about water quality. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know what's in contract or anything like that. I would definitely go have that conversation with them about the quality of that water, what they plan to do, if there's anything that they plan to filter it through. I'd also be curious about the distance and how far you are off from there. It's amazing what some dirt will do in between. It can really change the quality of water, and it can really clear it up, especially if you got good sandy soils or some sandy loam soils. It may be crystal clear water when it makes it to you. So those would be some of my questions. I think if you know that the quality of water may be bad, my first thing would be you may want to deal with that, because if they even stop the runoff from happening, inevitably it's going to happen probably with some runoff. So if that's a concern about water quality there, I would definitely approach that question first. And if the runoff is going to be an issue, then definitely I think the well will work, and it'll do the same thing. But that's where that cost comes in. Not knowing where the property's at, wells can get very expensive very quickly depending on what you're digging through.
I agree.
We just purchased 12 acres in Hayes County that straddles Onion Creek, but also have a ravine with natural springs that feed into the creek. How would those ground springs be categorized for the purpose of damming?
So a spring, as it bubbles up from the groundwater, that is considered, it's groundwater. So, but I would say that's the technical definition of it. And so you should be able to dam a spring, but, and this is just from experience because I've had it happen to clients before. If you're on Onion Creek, you're in Hayes County, you got neighbors that really care about that creek and really will get mad once you start doing construction over there. So you probably want to, do a little bit more reconnaissance, figure out what's the flow pattern there. Is it really, I'd just be interested to see like how much does it feed the creek and how close is it, and probably get an engineer to talk to you a little bit about those flow patterns, because that would really determine what you could do in terms of damming it.
And I know we've got a few more, guys, but I'm going to have to call it. This will be the last question of the evening. And if we did not get to yours, again, I've got our contact information up here. Feel free to shoot us an email. If you sent in a question and you did not mark it as anonymous, I can actually see your name and email associated with it. So I'll save those and we'll just follow up with you after the event tomorrow, if that works. So last question.
I think those two that are up here, I think those two were kind of attached to that last one that I answered.
Yeah,
Yeah.
got it.
So I think the
Supporting
next
a
one.
well with well water runoff.
Yeah. I think it was kind of attached to that one. So.
Okay, well then I'll go on down to the next one. Thank you for catching that, David. So a tank or pond does or does not qualify for one of the 7 activities.
So it does. Generally, it does. I'll say that without making any recommendations about activities or anything on a property, without seeing it. But generally, it would. It would probably count under an erosion control activity. So building a pond or building a tank fits underneath erosion control. Generally, those are 10-year activities that can continue for 10 years. Generally, because they're large, big projects that may take multiple years and a lot of money. So the way that the guidelines read is those can count for up to 10 years. So yeah, building a pond does. It doesn't count underneath supplemental water. Seems a little counterintuitive, but it actually counts underneath erosion control. But then you could also maybe utilize a well to keep at a constant level at a certain point and count underneath supplemental water after the credit is used up for the erosion control activity.
Awesome. Thanks, David. And I feel like we came full circle with the wildlife management there. So I really appreciate everybody hanging in with us tonight and listening in to this presentation. Thank you, David and Carly, for all of the great information. This has been recorded, so I will send out a follow-up email tomorrow and you'll have that recording, and welcome to rewatch or share with your friends that might have or want some information on water for wildlife and water rights. And otherwise, I will let you all go and have a great evening.
Thanks, Avalon.
Thanks, everyone.